As a big fan of horror movies, the recently advertised release of Killer Frequency, a story about a killer on the loose in a small town in the 1980s, had me reminiscing about looking at all of the knockoff slasher movies in the local video stores as a kid or watching the genre classics with my older cousin. Needless to say, I had to give this one a try. Well, it's just released on the Nintendo Switch. Is it more of a killer tune or a video nasty? Well, thank you to the publishing team for the review code, and now let's find out.
The Whistling Man?
He was a serial killer back in the 50s.
The story is set in 1987 and revolves around Forrest Nash, a local radio DJ in a small town. Forrest gets a little more than he bargained for when a local legend, the Whistling Man, a murderer long thought dead, appears to return and rampages through the sleepy town one night, murdering the sheriff and effectively disabling the local emergency services in the process. Due to this, the 911 operator leaves town to seek help and asks Forrest to take calls from any locals in distress during his show. It's billed as a comedy horror and the locals are an interesting bunch. Sometimes potential victims will call in, and at others suspects will too, and Forrest must make sense of it all and try to catch the killer as the night ticks on. It very much reminded me of something like My Bloody Valentine, the original, I'm not talking about the remake, or any of those B-tier slashers of the 80s, but combined with something like Pontypool, where everything is set in one location, ironically also in a radio station in that film. So gameplay wise, Killer Frequency basically puts you in the shoes of Forrest during this crazy night. You play from a first person perspective and must fulfill Forrest's role as a radio DJ, putting on records, playing cassette tapes consisting of advertisement jingles for local businesses, taking advice from your producer Peggy, and answering the phone lines via the buttons on your switchboard. This part of the game plays a tiny bit like Five Nights at Freddy's, just in terms of the need to keep a number of functions running by using a switchboard. The horror is handled completely differently here, and that's via the calls you will get from the locals. This is very much a comedy horror, as I said, with a heavy emphasis on the setting and the absurdity of the situation, with actual horror very much taking a back seat. Whilst a large chunk of time will be spent at your desk, as the footage will no doubt show, there is more to it than that. You see, as word of the killer reaches the citizens of the town, they begin to call into the show to ask Forrest, in his capacity of temporary 911 operator, for help. With no one to dispatch, he has to get creative to help them out of their predicament, and the answers and advice you give them will determine whether they live or die. For example, one of the callers is stuck in the centre of the local maze and can hear the Whistling Man approaching. You remember that a colleague of yours is a big fan of this local feature, so must find her maze map on her desk and then use this to guide the citizen out before he's caught. There are others, and they all follow the general pattern of you having to find something within the radio station offices, and you'll unlock more of the premises as you play, and then using the item to solve some sort of puzzle, giving the caller advice or instructions based on the information on said item. Things begin to tie together as you progress, and the identity of the killer starts to become clearer. I do feel that you are given a little too much guidance due to the comments from Peggy or Forrest himself, which does take away from the investigative side a little whilst finding relevant items, but the phone calls themselves are pretty clever in how they get you to use these features, and having gone in not knowing a huge amount about the premise, this was a pleasant surprise. As things progress, the clues become a bit more cryptic and the steps to solving the problems a little more elaborate, and this is where the game really hits its stride for me. I will say that I never felt the story ever completely felt comfortable in either of the comedy or horror brackets that it is aiming for. The comedy is fairly stilted, and whilst I feel that the single location setting can be very effective for horror, it doesn't really suit the comedy side and things do fall a bit flat because of it. The horror does fare a bit better, especially later in the game, and some of the calls can become pretty intense as you make your decisions that could cost someone their life. Now, the juxtaposition of menial everyday tasks that seem mundane against the imposing threat of something completely terrifying and out of the ordinary can be a powerful weapon in any horror-based medium. However, only if the task does not become a mundane experience for the viewer or player too, and unfortunately there is an element of this here due to the awkward control scheme. Performing the tasks, such as putting records on, replacing cassette tapes and using the buttons, can be pretty frustrating due to the sensitivity options never quite hitting the mark. Turning it up makes it almost impossible to stop on the intended target, whereas turning it right down fares better, but it's still very awkward. A lack of any sort of pointer controls is also a massive misstep, and the first hour of play was quite a chore as I acclimatised to the controls. I will say that playing with a Pro controller was much easier than the Joy-Cons due to the sticks being more responsive, but the game should cater for any such problems, not rely on a more expensive controller being used by the player. Killer Frequency is quite an interesting mix of button management and puzzle solving. Don't be put off by the footage that no doubt looks very samey, it does play better than it looks, and gameplay including story gets 17 out of 20. Controls are the weakest aspect of the game and gyroscopic aiming is sorely missed, but even this would have been okay if the sensitivity options were just a bit more robust. They get just 11 out of 20. When it comes to the visuals, Killer Frequency uses almost a comic book style with vibrant colours and thick black outlines adorning everything in the game world, and the nods to the 1980s are always fun to spot. With this in mind, there are some nice background details to flesh out the environment and some fun references made to horror, such as the names of some of the streets in the town being named after icons of the horror genre. Some of the assets are reused quite often and some of the details are difficult to read on the items themselves, although thankfully any key information will be written at the sides of the screen as you hover on the item. Performance wise, I did notice a few frame drops here and there, but it was pretty consistent for the most part to be fair, and in terms of the audio, the game is fully voice acted and there are quite a few colourful characters in this town, that's for sure.
Is she serious, Peggy?
She's serious about hearing that song, that's for sure.
Peggy, I mean, is she serious about...
I don't know, Forrest, but we don't really have a choice, do we?
The acting is of a fair standard, not always tonally consistent, but you could argue that this is intended owing to the more comedic nature of proceedings, and it does do a good job of keeping things flowing. Music in terms of background score is minimal, although there is an effective and quite sinister tune that plays during some of the more tense phone calls, but a lot of the actual game music is provided by the songs that are played on the record player in your role as DJ. These are fun to listen to and there are just about enough to prevent repetition, although a few more would have truly alleviated this problem. Visuals are effective, although some repetition in assets does ruin the illusion to some extent. They get 17 out of 20. Audio is a high point and serves the game well, although it plays much more into the comedy than the horror, and it also gets 17 out of 20. Killer Frequency costs £20.99 and regional equivalents are on your screen now. If you're watching this review in or around the time of its original release, there is currently a 20% discount until the 15th of June. It comes in at approximately 6 hours, but there are a few collectibles to find and the incentive of trying to keep all callers alive. I don't know if there are multiple endings based on your decisions, I couldn't find any information on this, but either way it didn't really strike me as a game that I'd feel the need to replay irrespective of the ending I got. That's not a negative, it's just more of a one and done affair in my opinion. Value gets 13 out of 20. To conclude, Killer Frequency is a fun nod to a beloved era of horror, being that slasher era, particularly the abundance of movies that appeared following the success of genre giants such as Halloween and Friday the 13th in the late 70s and early 80s. Its story is silly yet interesting enough to keep you playing, and I liked the gameplay hook of having to make decisions to keep someone on the end of a phone line safe. I even enjoyed how it was punctuated by those more mundane tasks of Forrest's job. The biggest issue is the controls, which are serviceable but could have been so much better. Ultimately though, this is a fun way to spend a couple of evenings if you have an affinity for 80s slashers.
Take a deep breath and let's keep going.
Evening, caller. This is Forrest Nash.
Killer Frequency gets a SwitchUp score of 75%. Thank you everybody for watching this review, I hope you enjoyed it. Please do remember to leave a like if you did. Don't forget, if you are looking for eShop credit to pick this game up, you can do so via our website, switchup.gg. You can get your eShop cards from there, and there's also a link down there to Play Asia if you're looking to import any games, not necessary for this game in particular, but if you do want to use it for any imports, use the link, use the code stated, and you can get yourself 5% off of your order. A quick thank you to our patrons and our channel members of course for your continued support, and to each and every one of you for watching our videos. Take care, and until next time, happy gaming.